Hello, Montana. Hello, Yangon, Myanmar, and hello, world. It's Chris Hislop from the Montana World Affairs Council. This is Connect Montana, where we bring the world to Montana and Montana to the world. We're a week away from the American elections, and you cannot get away from the cacophony of the campaigning and the election information that's coming at us from all sides. But there are other elections that are going on in the world at this time. Let's not forget about Tanzania, the Basque Country, Georgia, and soon Myanmar. So, what can we learn from elections around the world and those people and those organizations who support those elections? How do they deal with ballots, mail in ballots, polling stations? How about things like digital intrusion, and how about post balloting lawsuits? How does that work, and what happens in other places around the world? Well, this week we've invited three international experts on the show to tell us a little bit about how it works in other places in the world. On Tuesday, we had Hiroko Miyamura from the United Nations Department of Election Support. Yesterday, we had Justin Snyder from the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. And tonight, we have Sean Dunne from the Carter Center. This show is brought to you with the generous support of the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Stockman Bank, and Allegiance. Now, let me welcome our guest, Sean Dunne. Sean is an international expert in elections with over 20 years of experience in elections and democratic stabilization. His experience includes designing and managing international election assistance and observation programs, geopolitical, political economic, and security risk analysis, and the adoption and regulation of technology in and around elections. He holds master's degrees in both law and politics, and a bachelor's degree in software engineering. He's currently serving as the country representative and mission director for the Carter Center in Burma, heading an international election observation mission for the country's upcoming November elections. He has previously worked around the world in North and South America, the Middle East, Central Asia, Africa, Southeast Asia, and the South Pacific. In that time, he has worked and consulted for the United Nations, European Union, international NGOs, government agencies, and the private sector. Welcome, Sean Dunne. It's great to have you here on Connect Montana. How are you?
Very good, thanks, Chris, and good evening to you.
Sean, I wonder if you could start by telling our listeners a little bit in the broadest sense what the Carter Center does and what kind of support that your organizations and others provide to countries for their elections. And then a second part here is, of course, you're going to touch a little bit on post-conflict situations and the role that elections play and the role that organizations like yours play in those elections. Over to you, Sean.
Thanks very much, Chris. The process that we have here as the Carter Center being invited to observe Myanmar or Burma's upcoming elections really reflects a part of the commitment of the Carter Center and other organizations around the world that look to provide a level of independent analysis and to be able to reflect upon the process of how elections are conducted in a particular country. So whether or not the process itself has been undertaken credibly and genuinely, and whether or not the exercise of fundamental rights for voters to be able to register, for them to be included in the process, and then both the political and technical conditions for that election to be held. I note with some of your speakers earlier this week, they've been focusing on the technical assistance aspects. This, from our perspective, observation is more about rendering a characterization of the process against which we have international principles and obligations that then allow us to assess a process and to offer insights and views around an election. Is it credible? Is it genuine? And is the process legitimate? The Carter Center itself has observed around the world over the past 30 years, over 100 elections. And it's one of several organizations that came together in 2005 to actually create a declaration of principles for international election observation. And that was really driven by the interest of having a common set of principles by which the international community involves itself in elections. I think if I speak to the importance of having that viewpoint, an impartial assessment of an election process, what it speaks to is the fact that an election brings so many different pieces of a society together into a point of conflict, actually. If we look at elections as a process by which we offer a legitimization, a renewal of a mandate to govern, or for that mandate to be handed over to other political representatives. If we go back 100 years, the number of democracies in the world was quite small as we went into World War II, about 45, 46, depending on how people categorized it. Now, after having gone through what's been referred to as waves of democratization, we end up where we currently stand, where most countries, certainly more than 75%, claim to be a democracy of some type or nature. And democracy itself is really hard to define. It means different things to different people. I think, Chris, you know from your experience and our experience as we travel around the world and engage with different societies, different countries, their perceptions of democracy vary. Is it about rule of law? Is it about the rule of the majority respecting minority rights? There's a spectrum of issues by which people will seek to define democracy. So, of course, elections alone are not in and of themselves democracy, but they are a point at which all of these actors converge and actually enter into what I oftentimes refer to as political warfare. And it is the idea that warfare, that conflict, to see who will lead the country, who will have control of the organs of government. It is testing as to whether or not that transition of power can occur in a situation that is both in accordance with the laws of the country, fundamental principles of human rights for all people entitled to participate in the process. And when we look at it that way, if we go back that all of a sudden 200 years, those transitions were conducted on the battlefield. When we arrive at this point, democracy really is a critical stress test for the institutions and a society, because elections will pull apart a society. It's a divisive process that really looks to test where the majority stands, allows representatives to stand for election, and then, of course, for that process to then heal a country afterwards, which is one of the really significant issues. When we look at many of the transitions around the world, peace agreements in a variety of different contexts, what we see is that there is a series of negotiations to try and reduce conflict in a country, and oftentimes leading towards an election that will then legitimize a democratically elected representative for the country. And it's that process of pulling people apart to compete for the election, but then healing the country afterwards, which is such a great test. And when we look, for example, at the US in 2000, obviously with Al Gore versus George Bush Jr., the world took a gasp. You know, this is an incredible test. It's a stress test for the state of democracy in the US. Because again, democracy is hard to define, but if elections don't happen well, if the results are not accepted, that is really a barometer for the state of democracy. And the fact that the institutions in the US were able to weather that stress test, and in fact, the results were accepted and the country was able to move forward, was obviously a credit to the US. There are many countries in which we work around the world where that sort of uncertainty over the results would have led to violence on the streets. And again, when we come back to this process of elections, this act of political warfare, we see that over the course of the past several decades, as countries have adopted democracy, have bought into the ritual of conducting elections, then what we end up in is a situation where it is not always on a linear path of progress. It can backslide. There can be events where the results are not trusted, where the legitimacy of the process in some way is questioned. And that can give actors a reason to reject the results. If they don't feel as though the institutions of the state can fairly resolve those disputes, then it can trigger post-election violence. There is always around the world, when you get to that point of elections in any country, that oftentimes we will see, for example, the stock market will go down a little bit, and then once certainty is restored, election results are accepted, we actually oftentimes will see a kick up in the stock market. So we see different indicators that reflect the broader acceptance of that process. So when we look at elections precisely as a conflict point, there is every advantage that is sought to be taken. If we look at the language of elections, in particular in the US, what you've been hearing for the past few months regarding elections, obviously in the week ahead, but the language of it is the language of warfare. You mobilize your supporters to support your candidate. You accumulate resources to put into the war chest by which you can conduct your campaign. And it's these elements of that process, that language, that really reflects that elections are about conflict. And obviously the level of trust in which the society and the different groups have towards the capability of those that are administering the elections to render an accurate reflection of the ballots. The UN Charter, at its very heart, emphasizes the will of the people. And in a democracy, it is precisely the act of an election that is intended to reflect the will of the people as to who is the leader that will be legitimate and continuing through for the next 3 to 5 years, oftentimes. And that's important as well, the 3 to 5 years, because like any battle of different interests by different groups, what we're looking at is your ability to accept defeat in one election in many ways is influenced by your opportunity to then have another turn within that 3 to 5 year period. So the idea that no single individual or party is able to monopolize that political representation. And again, if we look at some of the process in the US, the 2-term limitation on the presidency is a structural legal feature that forces a renewal of leadership, and is one of the things that many countries that we go to and look at, obviously, as part of the discussions. So when you do have elections being mobilized, you have, obviously, it's very hard to avoid the influence of politics during an election process. And I say that not only for those that unfortunately want to actually watch some news from somewhere else in the world, they will be bombarded by messages, right? On television, on radio, billboards, pamphlets, emails, all of these things coming through to them. That process of generating interest around an election, the interest in precisely for these different groups to mobilize their supporters, is just an incredible amount of effort, and it becomes formalized in the voter registration process. If we look at, as I say, this act of political warfare, the voters are the bullets of these contending parties. And if you suppress voter participation, if you exclude groups from being able to participate, you're reducing the ammunition for the election. So sometimes we see strategies which are to mobilize voters, and other times to suppress voters. And when you come to situations of allowing for mail-in ballots or different types of systems that allow for avenues of participation, this is why they are so contentious, because this is the ammunition of the election. And we see it progress. And fundamentally, as the situation evolves through an election, what we really look for as an observer that is there to not have any interest in the actual election outcome, but rather in the process. Is the process credible? Are those that are eligible to vote allowed to register? Do they have that opportunity to participate? Can people stand as candidates? So with the progress and the process that we see for elections, we've also seen a modernization of that battlefield. It's the introduction of Facebook, the social media. When in 2002, obviously the US introduced the Help America Vote Act, which established the US Electoral Assistance Commission in the country to provide advice to the state authorities, but also after the 2000 election to introduce electronic voting. And the idea that, you know, the US would no longer suffer any more hanging chads. Where we've seen that around the world as a result, through Europe, through Latin America, through Africa, through Southeast Asia, we saw this incredible drive towards electronic voting systems. Could they be adopted? And one of the issues there is, again, transparency. That is so key. And this is what observation will oftentimes bring to an election process, is that impartial level of transparency, that looking at the results, looking at the process, not from a politically invested standpoint, but precisely as an independent actor. And we look at the transparency with which the exercise is conducted, the technical capacity with which it is conducted, and obviously an emphasis towards the acceptance of the results, not just technically, but socially. Has that election produced a result that people will stand behind for the next 3, 4, or 5 years, awaiting the next election? So the whole social media paradigm that has now entered in with Facebook and these other elements, it is another component of this process of political warfare. and the opportunity, obviously, for information to flow. What it does do, of course, and this has been highlighted by the situation in the US, is that once you introduce technology, once you've introduced the internet, you then also open an opportunity for foreign actors to also engage in that process in some way, shape, or form that may influence the outcomes. So, for example, here in Myanmar, we have an election observation mission that uses our traditional long-term and short-term observers, but we also have a specialized social media monitoring project that is there to monitor traffic on Facebook and to work with Facebook and other actors to identify, is there disinformation happening? Is there hate speech? Is there speech on social media that could incite violence? So in a sense, one of the things that observer missions do in these types of processes is we provide that independent view that both national actors as well as international actors can use to reduce their uncertainty around the credibility of a process. And that's important because that democratic stability, as I said, is linked to many other issues going on in a country. And obviously, it's a great privilege to have that opportunity and to be part of that process. And when the opportunities are there for the international community to watch this, the US is a great supporter of election observation abroad, as is the European Union and other organizations, both regional as well as national. And we will work with domestic observers, citizen organizations that will observe the election process as well, so that you have that viewpoint that is not tied to a particular political interest. And that oftentimes puts what I refer to as shock absorbers on the process. You're trying to reduce the amount of, how would one say, reduce the risks of violence. And a big aspect of that is always going to be that people cannot do things with impunity. That if they behave in a certain manner, if they break the rules of the game, then they will be held to account or it will be noted in the process. And this is generally what we face to varying degrees in a country, is the stakes of the election. What is the perceived risk of losing? So we always say that an election is unique in every country, but we can also suggest that every election within a country is unique itself, because it's reflecting the political interests, it's reflecting the political dynamics of the country at that particular time. And so we really see elections as this point of conflict. When well managed, it is a non-violent act of political warfare, but that can be quite fragile. And so putting those guardrails in place, having transparency in the process, bringing an independent view is really about building trust in the exercise that builds towards a wide acceptance of the results.
Sean, thank you so much for that. I mean, it is really a very interesting insight, this, the language of warfare and the connections with the tensions surrounding elections and war itself. We were very fortunate to have Hiroko Miyamura from the UN Department of Electoral Assistance here on Tuesday, and we did touch on this a little bit. I wonder if I could ask you, Sean, from you've got this very wide experience in a number of post-conflict places. Now, it's interesting that in a post-conflict society, we are looking for the people themselves to try to reestablish some kind of social order, because they are the ones who have the greatest stake in it, and the international community is there to support. Yet typically it is those people in that society that are the most battered, and frankly it's the most difficult task for a society to do. Now you must face this in elections, surely, that you have a war, and then you have an election that is kind of like a war. How do you temper the kind of warrior spirit that is coming out of a conflict and must inevitably spill into some of the elections you're working on? And I have to ask you to kind of answer quickly because we're running out of time. Sorry for that.
No problem. So you're absolutely right. It's about changing mindset and channeling these forces into a constructive nonviolent pathway. Oftentimes, as part of a peace agreement, we will see a process of disarmament, of reintegration of combatants into society and communities. And again, it's about that transition of moving the mindset from fighting for power through guns to fighting for power through an equitable political competition. And that opportunity that is afforded by the support and the intervention of the international community in these cases is precisely to try and bring down conflict. The loss of lives, first and foremost, but it also destroys the capacity of the state to care for its people. And this is one of the investments in democracy. This is also one of the reasons why the US is so symbolic and iconic in terms of the association between democracy and prosperity. Is there is an implicit relationship in many people's minds that the success of the US economically and the prosperity of its citizens is linked to the caliber of its democracy. It is the free market forces of politics, and the choice that voters have is something that is easy to take for granted. In other countries, your choice to vote for actually who you want is much more limited. And so when we see those transitions of process, when we see those interests, it is precisely about allowing people to compete, but taking away the guns and creating the framework in which that allows society to move forward. So that's one of the critical aspects. We are not taking away that conflict, but we are transitioning it into a nonviolent arena. And that's key.
Well, that's a great way to put it, Sean. And there's a long list of questions that we'd like to ask you, but sadly, we've run out of time. I want to thank you for those insights. I think they give us a lot to think about, not only about what happens around the world and the inner workings of elections, but how we might think about our own elections. I thought much of what you said is easily transferred into the American arena here as we head into our next election. So thank you very much for those insights. And thanks again to our sponsors, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, and Stockman Bank. Thanks to those who were participating tonight and those who are viewing this on YouTube. Again, we've had 2 previous shows, and tonight's show with Sean Dunne will also be on YouTube. So please check it out there. If you have any other ideas for other shows or things you'd like to see, please drop me a line. You can check us out at www.montanaworldaffairs.org, right there over my shoulder. And we look forward to seeing you in our next series. Sean, thanks again. Very nice to have you on the show. Everybody, be well. Goodbye.
Norway, the sudden increase.
The UN Truth Supervision Organization